Hi, thank you for joining us today. I'm Henry Farrell, and I'm a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, and I'm going to be your moderator for another episode in SNF Agora Conversations, the politics and policy of COVID-19. SNF Agora is a relatively new institute at Johns Hopkins that examines challenges to democracy and identifies actionable solutions. They created this new weekly series to offer a social scientific, evidence-based approach to exploring the difficult political and policy issues that are arising right now around the pandemic. So I'm excited to be a part of this and to be leading today's conversation about how COVID-19 is going to affect globalization and the international liberal order. And joining me today are two wonderful scholars who have done a lot of thinking about these issues. First of all, we have Naazneen Barma, who is currently an associate professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. And she is also the incoming director of the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy and the Scrivner Chair at the University of Denver's Korbel School of International Studies. We also have Hal Brands, who is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So thank you both, Naz and Hal. Thank you both for being here today. What we're going to do today, we're going to spend about 30 minutes, first of all, discussing globalization and the liberal international order of free trade institutions and cooperation that underpins the current model of globalization that we have. So that model of globalization was already reeling before coronavirus hit under the twin challenges of populism and the rise of an illiberal power, China, which was partly integrated into this liberal international order, but also has its own interests and its own quite different way of thinking about the world. In addition to all of this, the current model of globalization has had a variety of its own internal stresses and strains, which have been becoming increasingly apparent over the last several months. So now, of course, we're facing into the coronavirus epidemic, which you can think about as being a kind of force multiplier, perhaps, for many of the existing tensions. You can also think about it as being a cause of new stresses and strains in its own right, or perhaps if you are very optimistic, you might think about it as a global challenge that might perhaps spur over the longer run new forms of global cooperation. So these are the questions that we're going to be talking about today. And we'll spend about 30 minutes discussing this, and then after that, we will open it up to you, the audience members, for your questions. Anytime during this conversation, you can submit a question through the dialog box, which is right next to the video or just below it, depending upon the device that you're using. One thing that we should be clear about is that none of us are medical experts. If you have any medical questions, do not ask us. We cannot provide useful advice. We can't answer those questions. So if you can just focus on the politics and the policy of globalization and the coronavirus, which are the things that we are indeed qualified to tell you about. So how I'd like to start the conversation is by turning to Hal and talking about international security, which is a topic that Hal has done a lot of thinking about, and in particular about the relationship between the United States and China. Because even before we had the coronavirus, there was a lot of stress and strain in that relationship, a lot of stress and strain in these two great powers and how they were dealing with each other. And now, of course, we have seen more and more tension arising, strong and angry statements arising on both sides. We see President Trump saying things. We see so-called wolf warrior diplomats on the Chinese side saying things. So how is the pandemic worsening the tensions between the United States and China? And what kinds of consequences is it likely to have for that relationship?
So the likely consequences are not going to be anything good. And so it's useful probably to back up a little bit and put this in context. And so the pandemic hit about 3 or 4 years into a big shift in US policy toward China and the way that Americans think about China in the international system. And so with some degree of simplification, for about 25 years after the Cold War, the hope was that China was going to become progressively more reconciled to an international system that America led over time. And there appeared to be some reason to think that was happening into the early 2000s with China's economic integration into the world trading system, and so on and so forth. What's happened over the last few years is Americans, particularly in the national security community, but also in other communities, have concluded that that thesis wasn't actually being borne out, that China was becoming more disruptive in its international behavior in the South China Sea and the international trading system and elsewhere, and that it was becoming less liberal internally. It was reverting to a deeper form of authoritarianism under Xi Jinping. And so that conclusion is kind of the underpinning of a turn in US policy toward China over the past 3-4 years that has been represented somewhat erratically by the Trump administration and by the president himself. What's interesting, though, is that up until late 2019, early 2020, American national security and foreign policy elites were convinced that China was the biggest threat the United States faced, but most Americans weren't. And so if you looked at the public opinion of polling on this stuff, it showed that Americans were still more concerned with terrorism, other threats coming out of the Middle East than they were with so-called great power competition with China. What's remarkable is that the pandemic has shifted this. And so there has been a shift across both parties, across various demographics toward a more skeptical view of China, because the pandemic has shown that what happens in China and the Chinese regime's behavior can have a really direct and really negative impact on the well-being and physical security of Americans. And so as that has happened, the climate in the United States has become increasingly hostile toward China. China has responded very negatively to the criticism that it's getting. And so you're seeing a spiral in relations where the hostility seems to be ratcheting up. We've hit sort of a temporary ceasefire where the two sides are no longer sniping at each other so much in public. But nonetheless, I think this is simply going to act, as you said, Henry, as a force multiplier for the tensions in the relationship. And we're going to be dealing with a more hostile relationship for many years to come.
So this is something which is, on the one hand, we've seen a sudden turn of public attention towards this. But on the other hand, as you say, this has been a change which has been going on for the last 3 or 4 years. So how well prepared is the United States to deal with this new reality and to start to exploring policy options that will allow it to defend its interests in this world, which is very different from what people thought was going to be the world we were in 10 or 15 years ago?
So in some ways, we're very well prepared, and in some ways, we're not prepared at all. And we're very well prepared in the sense that just holistically speaking, the United States is a stronger competitor. It's a stronger society than China is. And so that sets up nicely in our favor over the long term. I think we're set up nicely in the sense that, as we discussed, there's been a growing recognition of the challenge that China poses. I think we're less well prepared when it comes to actually generating initiatives and policies that will make us competitively effective without being unnecessarily confrontational. And so if you were designing a policy that was meant to protect American geopolitical influence and democratic values and economic competitiveness against an authoritarian challenger, you probably wouldn't start by picking fights with all of America's democratic allies on trade and geopolitics and other issues. But that's precisely what we've done under this administration. You probably wouldn't start by withdrawing from an arrangement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was meant to strengthen the resilience of the Asia-Pacific economies against Chinese pressure and coercion. But again, that's exactly what we've done. And so there are some negative indicators in that sense. And then one last thing that I worry about is that the fiscal response that the US government has taken to COVID is entirely warranted. The United States isn't going to be able to accomplish anything at home or abroad if the economy craters as a result of this over the long term. But it's also promoting probably a medium-term fiscal reckoning, because we're blowing the deficit up to the moon, and we're going to have to ratchet that back at some point. And if you look at how we've done that in the past, we usually take a big chunk out of defense and foreign affairs to do that. And so one of the dangers we're confronting is that we're moving into a tenser relationship with China just at the moment when we may be losing some of the tools or weakening some of the tools we would use in that competition.
So Naz, as Hal has just said, this is not just a story about the United States and China. Other states are important as well. And so your work looks at these states very often in their own right. So if we were to look at non-great powers, if we were to look away from the United States, China, and the other great powers, to look at how other countries are dealing with coronavirus, are we seeing similar strains and tensions emerging among them that parallel perhaps in some way this force multiplier effect?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here with both of you, Henry and Hal. I want to kind of pivot into the question that you just asked, Henry, by reflecting on something Hal said a couple of minutes ago, which was his point that I very much agree with, that China's sort of stance towards the world has taken a more illiberal turn, and certainly matching its kind of more authoritarian turn internally. And I would agree that that is the case sort of on the security and on the geopolitical front. Perhaps on the economic front, on the international geoeconomic front, China has sort of perhaps schizophrenically tried to also project a little bit more of a beneficent image toward the rest of the world. And I'm remembering, it seems like an eternity ago, but I think it was only last year, Xi Jinping at Davos claiming the mantle of liberalism for China in the face of the retrenchment of Europe and the United States in the global economy. And so I think China is sort of similarly now pivoting from its own internal devastation as a result of the coronavirus to trying to project that sort of economic power overseas via medical equipment provision, scientific research and advice, and so on. Sort of in that context, in the context of what Hal just sketched out as the US's response, the general trend in the rest of the world, to me, appears to be a much more inward turn. And reflecting, again, the points that both of you have made, that this is a force multiplier in many ways, it's a doubling down on an internal focus that was already taking place in the rest of the world. So for example, one of the things that I found most surprising, although I probably shouldn't have, is how very nationally centered the responses of major European countries have been. Italy, Spain, Germany, France, they've all essentially taken their own measures, even in the context of an EU that is, of course, highly economically integrated and also very integrated in the regulatory sense. What have the BRICS done? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They've all sort of focused internally in terms of shutting down their economies in order to contend with the coronavirus and so on. So to the extent that there have been geopolitical implications emerging from the rest of the world, they have centered on that economic closure, I think. As you, Henry, and your colleague Abe Newman have written about in the context of your work on weaponized interdependence, the fact of supply chains is crucial in this regard, right? So the closure has started in medical supply chains. Turkey and Russia, for example, have banned exports of masks and respirators. But there's also a broader supply chain closure and disruption now emerging, which gives the countries that have the resources that everybody else wants an asymmetric power in this sort of geoeconomic context. So I think to the extent that there are emerging tensions, which was the heart of your question, I think that they're primarily economic in nature to begin with, but it remains to be seen whether these might morph more into this sort of into the security realm. To the extent that China's using its own resources and not hoarding them, sharing them with its Belt and Road Initiative allies and so on, including Italy, there is again that sort of asymmetric economic power projection. I think one thing that has emerged that's very interesting on this front, that it's not just state-to-state interaction. There's also states making partnerships with numerous subnational and non-state actors. So, for example, the fact of South Korea aiding Maryland, through deliveries of medical supplies and so on, or super rich elites like Bill Gates taking action on vaccine development and things like that. I think we need to pay attention to the non-state actors here as well. And let me just kind of wrap up on this question by saying, repeating the notion that the forces that have sort of been upon us probably since 2008, since the global financial crisis, are now kind of finally the chickens are coming home to roost in some sense. So we've been talking about deglobalization for a long time, and maybe now it's actually here.
So we've got a world where you describe, Naz, where we see on the one hand, we see this inward turn that states are making around the world. On the other hand, we see how relationships between states are becoming, as you say, they're becoming based on power projection, on who has resources and who doesn't, and also this kind of weaponized interdependence world that we see. So given all of this, this is a set of state level responses and internally focused and somewhat self-centered state responses to what is a global challenge. So do you see any possibility of global cooperation? Do you see this perhaps emerging from the private sector actors that you talked about towards the end of your answer there? And can they provide anything that approximates to a plausible substitute for the kinds of cooperation and collaboration we have sometimes seen in the past?
Yeah, I think, again, this is the question of the moment in terms of what the global institutional architecture has to offer on the global challenge of our times. And I think here again we have the legacy of the relative, I would, from the perspective of today, call it the disintegration of the traditional institutions of global cooperation, from the sort of 1970s onwards, the crumbling of the liberal international order that we've all been sort of writing about and thinking about for some time. But this is, again, the response to the failed international response to the pandemic is a consequence of this longer term trend of challenge in terms of global cooperation on these international issues. I think what we're going to start to see in terms of a sort of a potential silver lining here is that as international institutions and the traditional global powers that the rest of the world has looked to kind of step in and resolve such issues, like the United States, like the European Union, in the face of a lack of action, if those countries are focused internally themselves, I think we're going to see governance innovation coming from other parts of the world. So, for example, the fact that I think you see sort of an interesting bifurcation in the BRICS themselves. You see this more kind of populist and strong government-oriented shutdown in India. You see it in Brazil. You see it to some extent in Russia. But there are sort of more technocratic responses, such as that of Prime Minister Modi in India. And then there are the more sort of demagogic responses, such as that of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And I find it interesting. I was just reflecting on the fact that Vladimir Putin has actually been quite quiet in all this, and I'm wondering, what's going on there. But I think you see that the countries that have both sort of strong governments as well as strong state capacity are generating these sort of interesting new responses that I think other countries in the rest of the world are starting to look to model.
So Hal, one of the things that we tend to think about where big multilateral stuff doesn't work is we tend to think about, for example, what you can see happening between alliances of states, for example, the United States and its European and Asian allies. But you indicated that relationships between those aren't that great at the moment. Do you see any possibility that those relationships might be revitalized to try and produce something like a better and more coherent and coordinated response among those powers, at least, which ought to share some interests in order to try and respond better to this crisis that we're in?
So maybe in January 2021. As much as we talk about the rise of China and the importance of the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific or whatever you want to call that part of the world, for me, the most troubling development of the last few years has been the erosion of the transatlantic relationship, because the US plus Europe is still the greatest agglomeration of democratic countries and powerful democratic countries in the world. And so it's an illusion to think that the United States can solve any global problem, whether that's the challenge for China or any transnational issue, without a close US-European relationship. Not all of the blame for that deterioration falls on Donald Trump, although he certainly hasn't helped. And so what is the crisis going to do to that relationship? It's important to give the US government credit for things it has done well, right? And so the Federal Reserve is acting again as essentially the central banker to the world in the way that it did after 2008. That's incredibly important. But in general, the crisis doesn't seem to be ameliorating the strains in the US-Europe relationship. It seems to be exacerbating them in a couple of respects. It set off some fairly competitive dynamics with respect to treatments, potential treatments, whether therapeutics or vaccines for COVID-19 in a way that seems likely to sow more mistrust in the relationship. There's been a degree of frustration on the European part that the United States has seemed to take an obstructionist or sort of a petty approach in meetings like the G7 a month or so ago, when Mike Pompeo essentially torpedoed the joint communique over the demand to call it the Wuhan virus or the China virus, as opposed to coronavirus. And in general, I think that the crisis is also having a weakening rather than a strengthening effect on the cohesion of Europe itself, which is not actually good for the United States. It's not actually good for the transatlantic relationship over the long term. It may make it easier for us to divide and conquer within Europe, but that's not actually what we should be trying to do. And then finally, while one of the early fears in the crisis was that China was going to come out of this looking really good and the United States was going to come out of it looking really bad, that hasn't materialized. I think there's a lot of frustration in Europe with the role that China has played, both in concealing information about the initial outbreak and then doing victory laps when it delivers faulty masks and tests at a significant price to countries like Spain, for instance. At the same time, the US response has not inspired a whole lot of confidence either. And in dealing with Europe or in dealing with other countries around the world, what ultimately underpins American leadership is not just the hard reality of American power, it's the perception that the United States knows how to use that power competently. And I don't think anyone around the world is looking at the United States, and particularly the top political leadership, and saying this is an example of a highly competent superpower that really has its own house in order. If you're watching, the president's daily briefings and press conferences, you get precisely the opposite impression. In a way that's unfair. Like a lot of what's happened in the Trump era, the rhetoric is 10 times worse than the reality. But nonetheless, the rhetoric is awful and the reality isn't great when it comes to America's response to coronavirus. And so that's certainly going to have a negative impact on perceptions of what the United States can do and how reliable it is over the long term. You might get a chance for a reset in the relationship once Trump leaves the scene. But what exactly that'll look like, I think, remains unclear, given all the disintegrative dynamics on the European side and all of the longer running tensions in that relationship.
So one thing I'd like to maybe drill in a little further on, which is that in this conversation, we've talked a lot about things like vaccines, we've talked about supply chains, we've talked about all of these issues, which are new issues or relatively new issues on the security agenda that people weren't thinking about systematically before and that have suddenly become prominent. But of course, there are a lot of more traditional security questions involving military forces, things that kill people intentionally rather than unintentionally or as a product of a contagion. What kinds of consequences is this unraveling having for those kinds of security issues? And are we maybe forgetting them a little bit too quickly in our rush to look at a world of supply chain crisis and all of these other problems that are besetting us?
So it is totally natural and understandable that in the wake of a shock like this, whatever caused the shock zooms up the list of priorities when it comes to national security. And so we're absolutely going to see pandemics and other kind of soft security issues, you might call them, take on greater prominence. There's already some discussion about funding pandemic preparedness in a way similar to how we fund ongoing military operations overseas, which gives you a sense of the priority with which this is viewed. That said, the hard security agenda is not going away. And I'll just give you a couple examples of ways in which it could actually worsen as a result of coronavirus. So one, you haven't seen any abatement of Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea since this crisis started. By some measures, it's actually ticked up. The Chinese may see this as sort of a strategic window of opportunity while the US Navy, its carriers are laid up in port and America is distracted to push its influence in that area. If you get widespread strains that lead to a disintegration of what tenuous order there is in a number of Middle Eastern countries, you could see a resurgence of threats from terrorist groups, such as the Islamic State, in a way that would threaten American security interests and American allies. And so one of the challenges that's posed by this crisis is that we're kind of going to have to do everything on the back end of this. We're going to have to emphasize soft security issues more, but the hard security agenda is not going away and may even be getting more difficult.
So, Naz, when we think about, do you want to jump in there?
Please, that would be great, Henry. Thank you. I think, in addition to those interstate hard security issues that Hal has just pointed to, there's kind of a lingering list of intrastate security issues that haven't sort of gone away, right? And I think one of the concerns that I think is sort of accentuating now is that the responses to the virus in terms of sort of economic closure and border closure and so on are actually kind of making the drivers of those kinds of internal conflicts even worse, right? So a minute ago, I sort of said, well, perhaps Prime Minister Modi is doing fairly well in India in terms of the response and using the technocratic power of the state. Of course, at the same time, the response is accentuating these identity divisions that have been sort of, the norm in India over the last couple of years. So Muslims in particular have been, their rights have been violated, the rights of migrant workers, of course, the fact that in a country with large numbers of migrant workers like that, and this is the case now, of course, in some of the Gulf states as well, we see it in Singapore and the resurgence of the virus there. Migrant workers and their kind of second-class citizen rights are huge problems in this context and can lead to sort of major security concerns as well. And that's sort of not even getting into the question of Syria, for example.
Okay, so one final question, Naz, which is about 10 or 12 years ago, I think it was, you were one of the co-authors of a classic article, which I think has not gotten the recognition it deserves, with Steve Weber and other people, which looked at the possibility of a world without the West. In other words, what kind of world would we have if the Western powers, to some extent, abdicated or were out of the picture? And now we're in a world, of course, where the United States is not projecting itself as not having that kind of leadership role which it used to have, and where the European Union, as both of you have suggested in different ways, is caught up in its own internal conflicts and its own internal issues. So if we are seeing a world in which non-Western powers are coming to the fore, over the longer term, what kinds of consequences does this have for the ways in which coronavirus might be addressed? And what kinds of consequences might it have for the way in which the world political system and globalization might change over the longer term?
Thanks, Henry. That was a piece in, I think, 2007 in the National Interest with Eli Ratner and Steve Weber. And our kind of basic argument there was, even 13, 14 years ago, we could see emerging as stresses were placed on the institutions of the international system, a sense that as emerging powers were kind of gaining more resources, strengthening ties amongst themselves, an alternative governance architecture emerging in what we call the world without the West. And the argument that we tried to make is that this isn't something that we should necessarily see as a threat. As as Hal laid out at the very outset of our conversation, there was always this kind of framing in the American IR scholarship of, well, as China ascends, the US and China are either going to fight or they're going to assimilate, right? And our argument was that there's actually a third pathway where China kind of becomes stronger, but it sort of does its own thing and it creates a set of institutions around it and other emerging powers. And I think that we're sort of seeing again the accentuation of those trends in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. It has its downsides because it has negative consequences for the multilateral global cooperation that the world has often relied on for challenges of the magnitude that we're facing today. It also has its silver linings in the sense that it creates the space for these new governance innovations to emerge from different parts of the world, places where we wouldn't necessarily expect them to come from. And in particular, I think the reconstitution of the relationship between the state and the market around the world is something that we should be watching, right? As European countries have sort of managed to kind of at least dampen the negative economic consequences of the coronavirus through much more state intervention than the US has undertaken, Hal's comments about the Fed notwithstanding, I think you're going to see sort of new attempts to kind of try and rebalance these state-society market relationships emerging from the rest of the world. The last thing I'll say too is that the focus I think that we've placed in international relations scholarship, as well as in the American foreign policy community, on global institutions has perhaps blinded us to the fact that there are these innovations happening in other spaces. And so the pragmatic responses that sort of bubble up in relation to something like this that are non-institutional, I think we'll be seeing more and more of them. And they could be things that could be scaled up into something bigger.
Well, thank you both. This has just been a fantastic conversation between the two of you. And let me now move to questions from the audience. And we already have a number of questions. I'm not going to be able to deal with everybody's question, fortunately, in the 15 minutes that we have left, but I'm going to try and select a representative number of them. If you want to ask a question, let me remind you again, you can ask it through the dialogue box on the screen, which is either to your right or below, depending on what kind of device you are using. And again, just to remind you, we're not able to answer any medical questions. Do not come to us for medical advice because we will not give good medical advice. So let me start with a question, which is from Renee Marlin Bennett. And she asks, and this is a question after my own heart, she asks about how it is that information and disinformation seem to be weaponized in this pandemic, and what kinds of consequences this might have for globalization if we live in a world where information and disinformation are being used in these new and complex ways. So either of you, if either of you would like to answer that, I guess that crosses both of your areas of expertise.
I mean, I do think it's an incredibly important question, and it's right to sort of focus on that. And I would sort of come at it from a slightly different, perhaps tangential perspective, which is to say that the manipulation of information, the deliberate manipulation of information, comes alongside a diminishing of the role of expertise, scientific expertise, technocratic knowledge, and so on. Again, that's been a long-term trend. Henry, you started out kind of framing our conversation in light of the wave of nationalist populism that has sort of been now ongoing for over a decade around the world. And I think, these things have sort of come to a head in this particular context. In an interesting way, I think there's a real hunger today from the policymaking community, from corporate and subnational actors for expertise, for research, and so on and so forth. And so I think there's sort of an opening, just the fact of Dr. Anthony Fauci sort of being at the podium and, having a medical expert as we are not kind of being able to answer these questions, I think is incredibly important. And so perhaps it's not really the heart of the question, but perhaps one way of kind of at least attempting to sort of counter that is to kind of elevate the role of expertise again. And I think that is actually happening, at least in the medical side of this.
Okay, Hal, I'd like to roll two questions together if I could, because they both speak to complementary aspects. One is whether domestic politics and the high number of coronavirus cases and impacts, or cases and deaths, are likely to impact our overseas reputation and our international influence. That comes from SB. And the second is kind of a follow-up, which is whether the lack of global leadership by the US in this crisis has challenged the ability of the United States to shape globalization going forward.
So on the latter question, I think it certainly hasn't helped. And so there's a metaphor that I sometimes like to use in talking about the role that the United States has played in the international system since 1945, which is that we're kind of the first responder of first resort, right? It's the firefighter running toward the fire when disaster strikes and when a response is needed. And the United States has typically played the role of catalyzing collective action to deal with major problems. That was true in 2008, 2009 in response to the financial crisis. It's true dating back to the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. It's not true in this case. And while we shouldn't deprecate the ways in which the United States has used its structural power in the international economy, as we discussed before, to provide a degree of liquidity and stability without which we would be in far worse shape than we're in right now, there's been very little of the leadership at kind of the diplomatic level and at the political level that we would traditionally expect. And so crises tend to accelerate dynamics that are already unfolding, and that's certainly true here. Where I think there's been growing doubt about America's, not so much its ability, but its willingness to lead on issues that are of great concern to large parts of the world and large parts of the democratic world in particular, whether that's dealing with a global refugee crisis or dealing with the threat posed by climate change or dealing with the challenge posed by resurgent protectionism. And so this kind of adds another one to the list. And this is the most visible crisis of the past 12 years, certainly dating back to the financial crisis and perhaps even beyond that. And so certainly it's going to leave an intellectual residue when people think about the United States. With respect to the high number of cases and deaths, the United States, if you look at kind of cases and deaths per million people, the United States isn't doing great, but it's not doing awful, right? Compared to a number of European countries, for instance. And so I think it's less the fact that a lot of Americans are sick and a lot of Americans have died, tragic and alarming as that is, than the sense that the federal government in particular doesn't have a handle on the situation. The bright spot here is that in some ways, the crisis has proven to be a testament to American federalism and to the fact that in our system, there are compensating mechanisms when you have incompetence in one place. Since you've seen state and local governments play a much more constructive role in some cases in responding aggressively to the crisis early on and then trying to come out of it in ways that make sense. And what that reminds us is that while democracies, particularly federal democracies like the one that we have, are very messy, particularly when you get bad performance at the top, they're also more resilient than regimes in which there's a single point of failure.
So I have another question, which is from Christine, who asks, how do we reconcile the need to be realistic about the threat of China in the globalized world order with the need to prevent anti-Asian, anti-China prejudice in the United States?
I can take a quick crack at that one. I think that there are two things that are important here. And so one is making clear that when we talk about competition with China or hostility with China, what we're actually talking about is a dispute with the government of China and with the Chinese Communist Party in particular. The United States should be aligning itself with the aspirations of Chinese citizens who want greater respect for human rights and other things that we would support. And that's an important distinction to draw. The other thing is that for all of the stuff that the George W. Bush administration struggled in handling in the years after 9/11, one area where the president himself was rock solid was in saying, this is not a fight against the Islamic faith. This is not a fight between America and the Muslim community, and making clear that he abhorred incidents of anti-Muslim violence or prejudice in the United States. And that was exactly the right thing to do. It's exactly the sort of thing we need to be seeing today as well.
So Yvonne Angwenyi, and I may be mispronouncing her surname, for which apologies, asks, do you think that China's involvement in various African countries will continue post-COVID-19 or change? And if there are changes, what changes might we see?
I'll take a stab on this one. I'm not sure that I can think of what the sort of mechanism might be by which we would see less involvement. I mean, I think, a large part of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy comes from its ability to project this sort of economic power overseas, to project an image of sort of benevolent giving, to project an image that that its model, the state capitalist model that sort of emphasizes economic growth and to the benefit of the collective population is a good model for the rest of the developing world. And I think that's very much a part of the Chinese Communist Party's kind of contemporary sort of identity vis-a-vis the developing world. So I don't see that there's going to be necessarily a reduction there. Perhaps it could be a relative reduction in the sense of, if China is sort of focusing more in terms of the more traditional kind of Belt and Road countries in Central Asia and the Indo-Pacific. There may be a little bit of a reorientation there. I think the other thing to kind of just sort of keep in mind in this context is that the global growth projections are, of course, sort of horrifying if you look at what the projected economic growth rates are going to be over the next couple of years. And the particular sort of compacts between state and society that have maintained some element of stability in sub-Saharan Africa recently rest on a certain degree of economic growth, and to the extent that growth is going to be dampened in the developing world, you might see some kind of reorganization around the benefits that China sees in being active in sub-Saharan Africa.
So another question, which I'm pretty sure is aimed at Naz, from Nancy, who asks, could you please describe a couple of the new models that are emerging in other arenas that might influence international relations?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that question. The way that I'm thinking about this is that I think, again, kind of looking back to the international relations scholarship, the way that American foreign policy practitioners talk about where does good global governance come from, it's often aligned with the concept of liberalism, right? That we, the United States, as kind of the avatar of global liberalism, of the sort of the benefits of individual human rights, as Hal was just talking about, the benefits of open, free media, the benefits of individual choice through election, and so on. Those are the types of governance ideas that bring us these beneficial forms of global cooperation. So the notion that somehow global cooperation is tied in with those values of liberalism as manifested in the international organizations that were built after the end of the Second World War, the United Nations, and so on. I think what we might be seeing now is an emphasis more on pragmatic responses to these global governance challenges that could be seen as, in a sense, small L liberal. They're not ideological per se, but they are for the sort of the betterment of humanity, and the sense of sort of having protection for people who have, minority rights, fairness in terms of how the benefits of economic growth or the negative consequences of something like a pandemic are distributed around the world. And I think what we're seeing is an interesting sort of decoupling almost of the ideology of liberalism from the more pragmatic governance solutions that come about as a result of these more objective functions that governments are trying to solve.
So I'm going to close, I think. We probably just have time for a shortish answer or answers from the two of you, with again bundling together two questions. One from Christine, who asks how democratic regimes respond to threats such as China and Russia when the sources of vulnerability are so decentralized and diffuse, supply chains and so on. And also Sastur Fazala, who asks how we can reboot or reset the current technology and consumer industries, which deeply rely on global partnerships, and suggests that rebooting or resetting this hastily would very likely be unwise. So if either or both of you want to respond quickly to that.
I'll take just a quick crack at the second one, because it aligns with one of my intellectual hobby horses. And so we've talked a lot about a derailed globalization as a result of this crisis. I don't actually think that's what's going to happen. I think what you're going to see is a more selective globalization that's structured more along geopolitical lines than before. And so it's crazy to think that the United States can do away with supply chains in the way that the president seemed to suggest yesterday. That's not possible, and it would be a disaster for American economic performance and efficiency. What you can do is try to build greater resilience in particular areas of vulnerability. And so if you don't like the fact that all of your PPE comes from China, you can try to build greater resilience there. But the other thing you can try to do is that if there's going to be some selective delinking between the US and China, or between the democratic world and China more broadly, the way you compensate for that is by deeper integration within the democratic world, within the geopolitical coalition that you're trying to form to balance against a rising China, because that's the only way that you achieve the advantages of efficiency that economic integration brings while still limiting your geopolitical vulnerability.
So unfortunately, we have to bring it to a close here. So I want to thank both of you, Naz and Hal, for such a great conversation and such great answers to these questions. And thank you also to the audience for having watched and for having actually sent in those great questions and engaged in such a useful fashion with this complicated set of debates. So I will close by inviting people to tune in again next Friday to the SNF Agora, when there will be a conversation about keeping elections and voters safe in the age of COVID-19. The guests are going to be PJ Hogan, who is a former Maryland State Senator and a principal with Cornerstone Government Affairs, Franita Tolson, who's the Vice Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and a Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, Gould School of Law, and finally Martha Jones, who is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. So also I should say that a recording of today's webcast is going to be available at snfagora.jhu.edu, and I hope that we see all of you again next week for the next episode next Friday. Thank you all so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. And as I say, it is one of a series of conversations which I invite you all to continue to tune into. So thank you.